Hello and welcome to the video series on configuring Maestro. My name is Randy. I'm the lead developer for Maestro for Nextide. The Maestro module is a business process automation engine, and you'll find it freely available off the Drupal.org website. This video series attempts to take people through the configuration of Maestro and how to actually build a very simple workflow process. First things first, we need to discuss what Maestro is, some of its terminology, and how it's configured. What we're looking at here is a very stock Drupal 9 website. And in fact, what we have installed is just very basic components to make Maestro work. First of all, Maestro and all of its core modules are installed. I also have a Maestro form approval workflow example that's installed. We have web form and web form UI installed. We've got a few other little helper modules as well, such as token, which we'll use later on when we're configuring Maestro. We've got things like the admin toolbar as well. However, what you will require at the bare minimum is Maestro and all of its core modules installed. The way Maestro works is in three parts. We have the user interface called the task console. This task console is a default task console that we give you right from Maestro itself. It's one of the modules you can install. You can actually create your own task console via views. However, this task console is very functional and provides you at least a starting point in order to get your workflows created. The task console is where end users will see and be able to execute tasks that are assigned to them. Insofar as the administration is concerned, there's two aspects to that. We have the template builder, where you will actually be building your workflow templates. The slogan for Maestro is that if you can flowchart it, you can automate it with Maestro, and that is the truth. So as long as you can draw a flowchart, the Maestro engine, which is called the Orchestrator, will be able to follow the arrows. And effectively, as we're seeing here in this example of the form approval workflow example, this particular workflow will start with the start, follow through this particular path and potentially loop over this area and eventually end. So it's a very visual designer that allows you as the designer of the workflow to do a lot of this kind of automation without doing any coding. However, as this video series continues, we'll actually look at how using some coding can extend or expand the capabilities of Maestro. The third aspect to Maestro is actually the workflow engine itself. We call the workflow engine the Orchestrator because what it does is actually orchestrates the execution of your workflow templates. If you recall to that workflow I just showed you, all of those arrows are exactly what the Orchestrator does on each and every cycle or execution cycle that it has. It will follow those arrows, assigning or completing tasks based on whatever's inside of its queue. There's a few things here in the engine settings that you will have to configure. By default, we have the token not filled in, and this is by design. The reason is that the Orchestrator since it is the engine, it should be run outside of end user clicks. In other words, you would like to have the workflow engine continue running on its own without having users actually on the site. And this is done by pinging. There's a few methods to do this. This particular URL, and in my case my URL is Maestro-D9, and so the Orchestrator URL that I would use is http://maestro-d9/orchestrator/ and then whatever token I have in here. So my not secure token of ABCDEFG would actually be replaced in here. So I would have http://maestro-d9/orchestrator/ABCDEFG. And by having a token in here means that your Orchestrator, the engine, will actually be able to execute and actually be able to follow and traverse your workflow patterns that you create. The thing to keep in mind is that the Orchestrator will run on every single time it is hit either through this URL or via task console refreshes if you have this checkbox checked off. In other words, what that means, if we go back to a template builder in the form approval flow, each one of these boxes represents a task that will eventually end up inside of the Maestro Orchestrator engine. Every single time you hit that URL, as an example, it will run the orchestrator and execute the start task. The next time through, it will assign this particular task to a user. The next time through, it'll run this particular task. The next time through, it'll run this particular task, so on and so forth. So it's important to understand is that Maestro is not a real-time workflow engine. It never has been, and it never will be, especially in a web environment. However, for business process automation, it is more than ample. So that means as you're configuring your Maestro Orchestrator, it's important to understand what your particular workflow requirements are and how often you wish to lock the orchestrator for, and how often you'll actually be running the orchestrator through your automation routines outside of Drupal itself. We have a lot of documentation on this actually on our website, and actually how to test your orchestrator as well. Please refer to that documentation. Now, what's important to understand is the actual language or the taxonomy that we use associated with Maestro. First of all, we have the task console, and everything that shows up in here is a task that's eventually assigned to a user or a role. We have templates, and all the templates you create will show up in this area here. And if we look at the task editor for the form approval flow, we see all the tasks as mentioned before shown on the screen. What's important to note here is that any task with a blue border to it are human executable tasks. A human must execute these tasks. Everything else are tasks that are run by the orchestrator or by the Maestro Workflow Engine. So this should signal to you that there is the ability to do logical testing, such as this if statement, doing things that actually affect the workflow, such as setting variables, and actually the ability to run functions, custom functions, that you can write as a developer and allow the Maestro engine to run that. Examples of this for batch functions would be look up your manager in an Active Directory, fetch the details of a payment from a payment gateway. And all of this information can be run through a batch function, and a lot of that information can be brought back into a workflow in order to action upon via logical workflow tasks. So let's go back here and just add a simple template. And this is where we start to get into more of the terminology. A template is your workflow pattern. If you can flowchart it, you can automate it with Maestro, and this is where you begin that process. A template will require a label. I'll just call it example for now. We have a height and width in pixels of the canvas. All the canvas is your drawing area that you're able to drag and drop your tasks on. By constraining it to 900 by 800 gives you a little bit of room to actually start a relatively simple workflow template. You can expand this at any time. The showing details of a template's process in the task console we'll deal with in another video. However, when checked off, what this will do is actually attach views into the end user's task console, and any details that would appear would have a drop-down arrow here, and these particular views would show you a variety of information, and we'll show how that works later on in this demonstration. We have the ability to show stages throughout our workflow. It's a visual representation, a linear representation of where you are in your process. If you can picture you ordering something online, and the process that you see when you track your shipment is step 1 is ordered, step 2 is shipped, step 3 is out for delivery, and step 4 is delivered. You don't need to know the ins and outs of it has been picked, it's now on a cart, so on and so forth. All you need to know is that there's 4 steps to that. And this is what Maestro allows you to do by default with the functionality within Maestro itself. And then we have this mechanism called variables. Every template, every one of these templates that we create can have custom variables associated with it. So if you can imagine, if you're filling in a form and you want to send that to your manager, if you choose your manager from the form, you probably want your manager to actually be the one approving that form. Well, your manager may not be the same manager as somebody else's manager, so they would choose a different manager. So every instance of this template being executed, you would actually be able to choose different managers and thereby populating different variables within your workflow. So these are called template variables at this point in time because they're associated with a template. And there's a few very special template variables. Allow me to create the template and I'll show you them. Here's our example, and it needs validation. This is very important. The term needs validation. In fact, when I go into the task editor, you'll see that it also says it needs validation before it can be used. This is very important to understand. Workflows need validation in order for you as an end user, as well as the engine, to hopefully ensure that your workflow does not get hung up in places. The validation engine effectively tries to determine, is there an area that could cause problems for your workflow's functionality. All you would have to do is click validity check, make sure it is passed, and save that validity, and that error message goes away. If your template has not been validated, you will not be able to execute it, nor will you be able to hook that workflow up to anything like a web form. Now let's take a quick look back at the template. We call it example, we had a canvas site, I said show it in details, and now Maestro, upon saving, has filled this in with two views. You can drag and drop these to different locations, and we'll see how this looks later. But you're able to see tasks that are completed within this process and attached to a workflow. So when you put this template into production and somebody's executing tasks within it, when they look at their task console, they'll be able to see items that are attached to this workflow, such as nodes, web forms, and any other entity that you decide to route through your workflow, as well as all the tasks that have been completed. Down here on variables, we have a number of variables that are generated for us automatically. The initiator is the most important. The initiator is a non-deletable variable, and what Maestro tries to do automatically for you is populate this variable with the username of the individual who started this process. In other words, if I kicked off a workflow template, we now call that a process. If you kicked off that same template, you would also have your own unique process. For both of our processes, we may be running the same template. However, our initiator variables, for my case, would be set to my username, and in your case, it would be set to your username. Variables are a very powerful mechanism within Maestro that allows you to carry within it any type of data that might help you route your application. So if you've got a form that needs to go to a manager, that manager might have been chosen from a drop-down list. It could have been looked up in an Active Directory. It could have been any method of determining who your manager is. My manager may not be your manager. And this is a great example of how we would populate our workflow and carry along some of that information with us. So let's look at the user interface here for the template builder. It's a drag and drop interface using scalable vector graphics. This is our canvas. You see it's 900 by 800. We have a small legend under here as well. So we have start task is green and the end task is red. Those two are unique colors signifying exactly that. Start and stop. What's interesting is that the start task, you can only draw lines to it and remove lines from it. You cannot delete it. You can never delete the start task. The end task, however, you can. You can actually remove it. And so what you're able to do is have any number of end tasks which will actually end the workflow process once the engine executes it. Interactive tasks. Anything that is blue are human executable tasks. Anything that is an orange or this gold color are logical engine tasks, and anything that is in this gray are batch function tasks. Code, custom code that is executed by Maestro on your behalf. So in essence, if we look back at our other templates like the form approval flow, as noted, anything in blue is human executable. Everything else is run by the engine. So here's the example of the batch flow, set flow name batch function. It's in gray. It's an operation that the Maestro engine will execute on its own and execute code for you. Everything else, such as this if task, as noted by the legend, is a logical engine task, doing things like testing situations, setting a variable, testing a variable, anding or oring multiple lines of the process together. And here's a simple example that we provide with Maestro as well, the simple parallel to serial workflow. And what you see here is when we start this process, it immediately splits into two parallel tasks. We then combine those into a singular serial stretch of tasks back down to interactive task number 3 using an OR. Now the OR will allow either one of these branches to continue and complete, and then allow interactive task number 3 to appear in the end user's task console even if interactive 2 or 1 have not completed. As long as one of these two have completed, interactive task 3 will eventually appear in somebody's task console. If we swap this out for, as we'll show here, the AND task, these two branches will have to wait, or the AND task will wait until both branches have completed in order to get interactive task 3. So I would suggest, if you're new to Maestro, just use these examples, simple parallel to serial, just to start to build very simple workflows. So let's go back to our example. Let me remove these lines and let's start to build a simple workflow. And by doing so, we have to understand how to add tasks. So let's add an interactive task. Interactive task is a task where you, as a workflow developer, can actually create your own Drupal forms and present that to the end user. Those forms can be presented in a full screen format or in a modal. And we'll see how this works as we have a few out of the box default Maestro interactive functions that allow you to just display information to a user. So, create the interactive task. We'll drag it over here and we'll edit it. And now this is the important part here, is we're actually editing this particular task and we're going to set it with some information. The first piece here is called the handler. This is the function that contains the form definition for this instance of the interactive task. It's a pretty big mouthful to say, but all this is saying is what function, what actual piece of Drupal code have you written or that we've provided through Maestro that will show the end user who receives this task assigned to them in their task console, what form would you like to show them? And out of the Maestro examples, we have a few that you can use. So if you just type in M, we do a lookup, and I'll just do a Maestro show message form. And it tells us it requires a process variable called message. Because what this particular handler does is when the user executes this task in their task console, it will use a variable called message to show the user a message. The return path is where you'd like to have Maestro reroute after the task has been completed. And we're going to send it back to the task console. And this is just a route. This could be anywhere in your site. It could be node/265 or whatever it is. It's a valid route within your Drupal system. And we're going to present this as a modal. We could present it as a full page or a modal. And we have two options down here, the notification details and the assignment. First things first, notification. We can notify users or an entire role of people. We can do that by a fixed value, such as user, such as admin, as an example, or a discrete user. Or we can actually notify by a variable. And we can choose which variable we would like to notify. And here's an example of a very dynamic workflow. We could notify that this task is ready to be executed and send that to the initiator of this workflow. I may have initiated it, you may have initiated it. That makes our two initiator variables unique between our two instances of this template running. We can also do reminder and escalation messages, and we're able to customize the subject and the message of the assignment, reminder, and escalation. For assignments, let's make this simple. We'll assign this particular task to a discrete user. We'll just go to admin and we'll save that task. And shown here again, after saving it, we see that this particular task has been assigned to a user by a fixed value of admin. So it's discretely assigned to the admin user. Great. Let's actually draw a line from start to our interactive task and end. Very simple workflow. Let's do a validity check. It says it's passed. We shall save that. And now let's try executing this. Let's go to our template builder. Here's our example flow. And in our operations, we have this option called Start Process. We get a message that says it's been started. Now, let's go back here to the home page. We don't see anything going on here yet, but let's go to our task console. And lo and behold, we have assigned example task number 1 from our workflow to the manager. However, when I click this execute, we're going to get a problem here. It's going to tell us that no process variable called message has been defined for this workflow template. If you recall, this particular function, interactive function, said you must have a variable called message. Fine, let's fix this. Let's complete this. As you see, the workflow engine continued. The task is now out of my task console. There's nothing left to execute. Super. Let's go back to the template builder and let's look at this. And let's remind ourselves what the problem is here. When I add this task, you'll see the Maestro show message handler does tell you it requires a process variable called message. And whatever's inside that process variable, namely message, will be shown to the end user in that approval, or in that, pardon me, the example task. So let's do that. Let's edit our template. Let's go to variables, and let's create one called message. And we'll update this. There we go. Let's go back to the template builder and let's start this process. It's been started. We go to our task console, and now when we execute, we get, well done, you've executed your first task. This is showing you that the process variable is actually being set by something inside of Maestro. It's a variable, so that you can now set or reset or change the values of these variables as the process continues. So let's end this task. Let's make sure that the workflow engine is completed. And let's actually do that use case. Let's go back here to our task editor. Let's remove these lines and let's add a set process variable task. We're going to set that message to something else. So let's make this look something like this. We will add another interactive task. And we'll do this. So what we're going to do is show the user the default message that we've already pre-populated in the message in this task. We will reset that message to something else using the Maestro engine. We'll show that variable back to the user again in this interactive task. So let's just draw our lines because we know this is the path we're going to take. And let's edit the set process variable. This particular task type allows you to set a variable of your choice. So let's set the message variable. We can set it by a hard-coded value, which is what we're going to do. We can add or subtract a value, such as add 1 to it, -1 from it. This is a great way to actually create a counting loop within Maestro, or by function. This is a little bit involved, and we have decent documentation on this, and we have examples of how this actually works. But you can actually write your own function, pass it parameters, and have it action upon that and set the process variable. So let's set it to a hard-coded value. Let's just say on task number 2. So we'll save that. Close. We'll edit the interactive task. We will show the message form. We're doing it a modal. We'll assign it to a user of admin. We'll save that. Close. Again, because we've added new tasks, we'll do a validity check. It says it's passed. So now let's execute this. Let's go to our template builder. Start process. The process has been started. Let's look at our task console. Here we have example task 1. I'll execute it. And it says, well done, you've executed your first task. If we recall back to our template, that template variable called message had a default value of this text. Well done, you've executed your first task. Complete. So now if we go back here to our template builder, just look at the task console, you have to keep in mind we've just executed this task. The engine now is about to execute this task for us. We won't see it. We won't even know it's been executed. But what we'll get eventually in our task console is example task number 2. So let's refresh our task console. And now we have example task number 2. And if we execute it, what we should see is you are now on task number 2 as the message. And there it is. You are now on task number 2. This is an example of us using a process variable and augmenting that process variable within our process in order to change the way your workflow works. And we'll complete that and the process disappears. One final thing. Let's rerun that process. Let's look back at our task console. We'll just execute the first task. We'll refresh and we'll wait for example task 2 and we'll look at our details drop down. So we're looking at items attached to this workflow. There's nothing. We aren't routing any documents. We're not routing web forms or content types. But we look at Maestro completed tasks. This is actually a complete list of tasks when they were assigned and when they were completed. Not bad. Within the minute. And so what you're able to do is show this detail or hide it by simply editing your template and checking or unchecking the show details of this template process in the task console. So let's update this. Let's go back to the task console. I'll just refresh it and you'll see the details disappear. Go back to your template, re-enable that option, update the template, and when I save, it reappears. And again, these are just views. And when we execute this, it's now complete. At the top here as an administrator, I get a few administrative options, such as outstanding tasks, all active tasks, and workflow history. Outstanding tasks will show any tasks that are interactive, so human executable, and who they're assigned to. All active tasks show you everything, interactive as well as any tasks that are engine executable. So here's an example. This particular workflow is now running the end task. Right? I just finished my task number 2. It has no assignees because it's an engine task. It's got a particular number of internal Maestro mechanisms, but we also have this powerful option called trace. And if you look at it, it'll tell you the start task was executed by whom. Example 1 was executed by whom. The set message, when you see anonymous, that's actually the Maestro engine because it runs anonymously. Example task number 2 is complete by admin. Example task, or the end task is still active, it has not been completed. And here's our variables in the system. I was the initiator, and here's our workflow message. And later on in this video series, you'll see how we'll actually have entity identifiers to show you the unique IDs and anything that's actually attached to this workflow. So what we can do is actually go back to our task console, and just by refreshing it again, because I've configured Maestro to run its orchestrator or its engine on task console refreshes, if I go back to trace and I refresh, you'll see that the end task is now successfully completed and it's been archived. We'll talk about some of these statuses in a little more detail in future videos. But suffice to say that this particular workflow process is ended, and we can actually see it in our workflow history. So here's our last workflow that we went through. We can look at its details, and we can also trace it. So that's your initial introduction to Maestro, building a very simple workflow. Future videos in the series will show you how to improve upon this and create workflows that are a little more complex and a little more usable. Thank you.